I want to briefly discuss what you might call, and has been called by a video series put out by the Society of St. Pius X, or people sympathetic to that society. It's been called the crisis in the church, or the crisis of the church. And I want to talk about some complications that arise in the realm of history. Now, just to give you a brief background, my thinking has started to change over, say, the last 6 months to a year. Although seeds of this change were sown many, many years ago. Just to sketch it, the way that I would have thought about this issue just a year ago would have been something like this: that the major fault lines in the Catholic Church today basically are between, let's call it modernism on the one hand and traditionalism on the other, or to put it in ways that would be maybe more memorable, between modernism on the one hand and pre-modernism on the other. There is a sense in which the modernist side of things then subdivides, and we could think of the subdivisions being, say, between conservative modernism and liberal modernism, or you could even perhaps redraw the overall comparison and say that what has actually happened is you have a distinction between modernism, postmodernism, and pre-modernism, where the liberal modernist would basically be something like the postmodernist. Now, I don't really want to put too much emphasis on these category distinctions. What I'm just trying to get you to see here is that that was my orientation before. And what I'm starting to think about, and by the way, the traditionalist side of it would also subdivide, and the primary thing there would be the difference between, let's just say, sedevacantism and non-sedevacantism traditionalism. So with this much scaffold in place, I would have said basically that if you become skeptical of modernism and postmodernism, modernism of any sort, conservative or liberal, anything basically, on the contemporary scene, starting roughly in the late 19th and then early 20th centuries, then you're going to be pushed to pre-modernism. And really the only question then that you have to answer is there a valid pope? And of course, I'm being sort of facetious here, but I'm trying to skim across the surface. So, of course, there's an entire bundle of issues that are associated with the question, not just the validity of the Pope, the validity of the Second Vatican Council, which is closely associated with the question of the legitimacy of the Pope, let's say. In addition to that, we have questions about whether or not there are valid sacraments, and a whole host of things come out of it, valid orders and that kind of thing. Now, along this way of thinking, or maybe motivating it, is the view which tends to go along with it, namely that you can tell a story about 19th and 20th century history that goes something like this: that the church was starting to be challenged from within by political liberal and theologically modernist tendencies, and that these were at war with a traditional, at that time, conservative faction of the church, which would be typified by people like Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo the 13th, by Pope Pius X, and so on. And then when you move through the history of the 20th century, you find, according to this story, that whereas the conservative side of things had the ascendancy, so during Vatican I, for example, the conservatives were in ascendancy. Then later on in the 20th century, the progressive modernist faction gains ascendancy and essentially hijacks the church, and to put it in the language of the Diamond Brothers, they have an internet base and they are sedevacantists. They refer to the mainline church as the counter church. The Vatican II church is the counter church, as opposed to traditional Catholicism, which is basically maintaining continuity from what came before Vatican II. Okay, that's the basic contour of the story. I've been in contact with Michael Hoffman for many, many years, going on probably over now 25 years. And he's written a number of books, including one that focuses on the occult infiltration of the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century. And so one of the very first cracks in that storyline, in my thinking, goes back to my exposure to Michael Hoffman when he, just to put it somewhat colorfully, and I don't say that Hoffman himself reduces it to this, but he would basically say, well, look, when you ask the question of where did things start to go wrong in the Catholic Church, surely you're not going to say that Francis, as liberal as maybe you think he was, or as much of a modernist, say, as Paul VI was, or maybe if John the 23rd was a Freemason. Regardless of all of this, they did not erect pagan Egyptian obelisks in Vatican City. They didn't put up these phallic symbols of pagan religion at the center of supposedly, basically, the capital, if you like, of Catholicism. That was done in the 16th century. And I kind of shelved that worry. It was like, yeah, that's a considerable worry. Now, he also focuses and wrote a whole book, Hoffman, on usury, which the subtitle of that is something like The Mortal Sin That Was and Is Not Anymore, or something like that. In other words, that at some point also the Catholic Church seems to have drifted away from its dogmatic, if you like, certainly doctrinal condemnation of usury, that is, lending money at interest, and somehow allowed it to happen. And the story there is rather interesting. But I want to focus on just the obelisks because I want to register these points as quickly as I can and not belabor things. But when you think about the 16th century, and in a moment I'm going to go beyond that backward in time just briefly, eventually this was actually carried out by Pope Sixtus V. And the date on it is rather interesting. It was September the 10th. This is the date, 1586. This was actually at least the date that was attached to the completion of the erection of the central obelisk that stands in St. Peter's Square now. 13-month project ending on September the 10th, 1586. This is quick searches, but the date there is quite interesting. I've talked about it in the Synchromistic project as being clearly related to the September 11th date, which in occult lore and in a certain stream of Protestant Christianity associated with people who come out of the Worldwide Church of God and that kind of thing, September 11th is the secret birthday, true birthday of Jesus Christ. So the interesting tie-in there to not the 11th, but September the 10th. I'm not sure if there's any waffling on that or how firm that date is, but clearly it was a major deal to install these obelisks, which would have weighed a huge amount. I mean, in a time before there were gas-powered cranes and the like of that. And so this was a difficult project. Evidently, it had been proposed first by Pope Nicholas V, who goes all the way back to the 14th century. And I'll say something more about him as well in a second. But the engineering project, and I've gone into this in a video titled Four Corners, for unrelated, that's not the theme of the video. Four Corners is obviously themed. The central focus is on the southwestern part of the United States where the four states come together. But in that video, I do talk about Domenico Fontana, who was the engineer, who was essentially tasked with this Herculean, literally, project of taking these obelisks, which are, in an Egyptian sense, a true obelisk is hewn out of a single piece of rock. It's not like the Washington Monument, which is a faux obelisk, if you want to say it that way, because it's made up of discrete bricks. These were one monolithic piece of, each obelisk was one piece of stone. Huge weight. And to have it shipped anywhere would have been a task, but to then stand it up, It's not like you could say, hey, scooch it a little bit to the left or something. I mean, once it's standing, it's where it needs to be, or it's where it's going to stay. So the quote-unquote astronomer, the Dominican Ignazio Danti, was tasked with helping to perform the calculations. And I presume that's because astronomy in the 16th century was starting to be one of the mathematically oriented sciences. But it's interesting there to entertain the possibility and question as to whether or not Dante also had a kind of astrological part in his dossier. And the importance of that might be that astrology is often tied to correspondences on the earth. So, for instance, you have Washington, D.C., which, according to writers as diverse as the OTO guy James Wasserman, and the writer David Oveson, talking about the architecture and the street plans of Washington, D.C., and how various of the monuments are designed to link to astronomical features. Venus is prominent in Oveson's analysis, I think. But this is nothing new. I mean, there are analyses of the Great Pyramids that talk about their correspondence, say, to the stars in Orion's belt. And the point I'm making is that Domenico Fontana was evidently helped by this astrologer Ignazio Danti. And so the Vatican seems to have been interested in putting these obelisks not just somewhere, anywhere, and not just centrally located so that they look pretty, but potentially one wonders whether or not there was some kind of occult angle, astrological angle to how they were conceiving of this project. Now, this isn't necessarily to say that it goes all the way to the top, but it is well to remember that this was after the Council of Trent. So Trent was roughly 1543 to 1565. So 1565, this was 1580s, 1590s that these obelisks were put up in the Vatican. So, okay, just pulling on a thread here and going back slightly to Nicholas V, the guy who first proposed this project. Sixtus V in the 16th century was the person who carried it out. It was his instruction, but Nicholas V was supposedly the person who first proposed it. He was a humanist, part of the Renaissance movement in Rome. And the context here is quite interesting and spills over into a lot of different areas. So, for instance, Nicholas V put the kibosh, I think, on the Council of Basel, which was one of the high points of conciliarism, which is a movement basically that was, first of all, it grew out of the Avignon papacy. That is to say, in the 14th century, you'll recall that the French had an outsized influence, at least if you ask the Italians, the French had an outsized influence to the point where, in the church, to the point where they were able to relocate for a period of something like 70 years. They relocated the headquarters of the Catholic Church to France in the city of Avignon. And there was the perception of corruption regarding this time period. It gives rise to the Western Schism, which begins after the Avignon period, so about late 14th century and into the 15th century, where you had popes, supposed popes, who were competing between Rome and Avignon. So there were popes in Avignon, and there were claimants of popes in Rome. They both claimed to be the pope. They all claimed to be the pope at one time. I think there was as many as 3 of them at one time. And this gave rise to not just a desire for reform, but also the need to clear this mess up. And so the idea was, well, maybe a council could be called that would depose the popes who were fake. They would discover the popes who were anti-popes, find the real pope, or elect a new pope. And so this was part of this background here. And so conciliarism began to articulate the idea that, hey, maybe the councils ought to have authority over the popes. And one of the people who got drawn into that, or who at least entered into the fray, was William of Ockham, who is associated with philosophical nominalism and the rejection of universals, which I've gotten into in another place and won't get into here. But, he argued, Ockham, that the church was a collection or a body of faithful, body of Christ. And he went away from the idea of hierarchy, which I think is probably bound up with his movement away from Platonism. His rejection of hierarchy is kind of an ancillary feature of an overall move away from this kind of participatory metaphysics that Duns Scotus and other of his Franciscan forebears were also pioneers of. So to someone like Ockham, the ultimate authority should be the church councils, and this is what was argued. But on the other hand, you had people like Niccolo Albergati, who was the trusted diplomat for Popes Martin V and for Eugene IV, and this guy was a papalist over the conciliarists, and so he was an agent of the papacy to the extent that Pope Nicholas V evidently selected the name Nicholas in deference to Niccolo Albergati, who was his patron and friend and so on. Now, the official condemnation of this was in the 16th century at the Fifth Lateran Council. And the Fifth Lateran Council is interestingly timed because it's called, I think, in 1512. It ends in 1517. Now, that's quite an important year in the history of the church, because that was when Martin Luther, late in the year, October the 31st, Halloween, nails his 95 Theses to the castle door at Wittenberg, that the Lateran Council, the Fifth Lateran Council, had concluded that very year and was supposed to be oriented and focused on church reforms. At least this is the way Wikipedia, if you look up ecumenical councils, it describes the Fifth Lateran Council as being preeminently focused on church reform. And it affirmed, the council evidently, it affirmed papal supremacy and so on. And it would have been called, of course, by Pope Leo X, who was part of the Medici family, the great, not great in a moral sense, but necessarily, but great as in powerful banking family from Italy, the Medicis. So a lot of intrigue, obviously, that is happening in that time period. And then in the 19th century, this papalist anti-conciliar trajectory is reinforced by the First Vatican Council in 1869 to 1870. And, of course, they famously added papal infallibility on. And you could think of it as a permanent blow, death blow to conciliarism. But what is furthermore interesting from the standpoint of these historical complications is that the Pastor Aeternus was the document that established papal infallibility, but it was rejected by a number of people, including the philosopher Franz Brentano, who was, I believe, either ordained or he was on the road to being ordained, and he just completely abandoned that and I think left the church. The most famous rejector of this doctrine was Ignaz von Derlinger, and of course he had such an influence, Derlinger, in Germany in particular, that there was an entire group of people who peeled away, if you like, became schismatic, according to the strictures anyway of Vatican I, and formed the Old Catholic Church. And they criticized it was kind of like, if you remember Reagan, President Ronald Wilson Reagan's comment when he started to run as a Republican. It was like, hey, he'd been a lifelong Democrat. And he said something along the lines of, when people asked him about why did he change parties, he basically said something like, and you can look it up, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And this is the call, this is the cry of people like those that I want to say formed the Old Catholic Church. But again, to them, they would say, we didn't form it. We are the continuity between the church before Vatican I and after. So the same kind of crisis, if you like, that followed Vatican II in terms of the formation of what we now think of as traditionalism. There was a similarity in that and the aftermath of Vatican I with respect to the formation of the old Catholic Church. And, of course, Vatican I was prematurely ended. There was no official end to it. It was just put on pause because the papal states themselves collapsed politically and militarily when one of the Italian, Victor Emmanuel or something, marched in. By the way, the date there, which I got into in a video on 9/11 sinks, the date there was September 11th when the papal states actually fell, and then 1870. And then as an intermediate point, you'll recall that the papal states were given some measure of political autonomy again in the 1920s, 1929, I think, when Benito Mussolini entered into a pact with the then Pope, Pius XI. So some intrigue there. But later, when John XXIII expressed his intention to call a council, it became necessary first to end officially Vatican I, which he did in, it was 59 or 60 or something like that. But you can find the dates there. I forget the details. Go to the video for the Synchromystic on 9/11 sinks when I talk about this, because some of the September 11ths again figure in. It was either to the conclusion of Vatican I or to the formal opening of Vatican II, and it's possible it was a fixture of both. I just don't recall. But that's just kind of a side note. The main point is, so you had these waves of, Vatican I, the articulation of papal infallibility caused a group of people to make similar arguments to today's traditionalists, namely the old Catholic bunch. Now, what's furthermore interesting to me is that there's echoes of this. So I've got background with St. Louis, Missouri. And when you think about some of these things, they're made more concrete in reference to St. Louis, Missouri. Well, how so? Well, one of St. Louis's very early archbishops, a guy by the name of Kenrick, and there's a seminary in St. Louis named after Archbishop Kenrick. Kenrick was opposed to papal infallibility, and he was an attendee at Vatican I, and the story goes that when it looked like the papal infallibility was going to pass with the vote that was going to be made by the bishops, Kenrick was one of a group of people, I forget how many, who left the Vatican so that he didn't have to vote against the doctrine, because it was basically a lock to be pushed through. This was the understanding, and indeed it was pushed through. But Kenrick was so opposed to it, but at the same time didn't want to vote against it, so the story goes again, in front of the Pope, that he left before the vote took place. Now, this is a guy, Kenrick, again, whose name is lent to a seminary. And it's quite interesting, I think, when you think about what that might imply about certain, especially American tendencies. In other words, they if you think that opposition to papal infallibility is a hallmark of progressivism or modernism or liberalism, and I don't want to bother distinguishing those terms. I think they ought to be distinguished, but I'm not going to bother to do it now. But if you think that that's an apt description, then somebody like Kenrick becomes a liberal, a progressive, a modernist. And again, just let's forget about the niceties of the distinctions that I think probably ought to be made there. Well, you can follow it along, just since I'm picking on St. Louis for a minute. When we think about the changes that occurred to the liturgy, namely the abandonment, such as traditionalists would describe it, the abandonment of the traditional Latin Mass or the Tridentine Mass, the Mass that was codified after the Council of Trent, although people like Michael Davies have written about the point that the actual Mass goes much further back than that. In Davies' estimation, you can trace core elements of it, of course, to the Last Supper when it comes to the actual consecration of the host, but that the substantial portions of it were even in place as early as the 4th century, that we have various books in Latin that trace back to the 5th century, 6th century, and so on, that demonstrate that portions of the Mass, in other words, that we shouldn't say, oh, well, it was created by the Council of Trent. So I'm not saying that. But after Vatican II, of course, there was a concilium tasked by Paul VI with revising, quote unquote, the liturgy, which they did, after the after Vatican II was concluded. So Vatican II, I think, was concluded in 65, called in 62, officially concluded in 65, I believe. And then the concilium, this working group, did its business. And finally, the Mass, the new Mass, the Novus Ordo Missae of Paul VI, was promulgated, I think, in 1969. And what I'm getting at is in St. Louis, the guy who took over, he didn't take over there was Cardinal Glennon in between. But when Cardinal Ritter takes over for Glennon, in 1964, Cardinal Ritter is saying an English language Mass at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis. This was the second English language Mass to be said. The first had been said the previous day. I forget the date. But it was said by a Boston priest by the name of Frederick McManus. Now, just to put this into some context here, Cardinal Ritter said this Mass in 1964, and McManus as well. The Second Vatican Council hadn't even concluded yet. Certainly the concilium hadn't done its job. There was no Mass of Paul VI officially in any capacity. So the Mass that was said in English by McManus and then the next day by Ritter, I don't know if it was the same rubrics they used, I don't know. But those were experimental, which again shows that there was some kind of definite progressive leaning here. Ritter had been, I think, the guy who in the 50s, the Catholics in the St. Louis area had started desegregation of Catholic schools and Catholic education well before the official civil rights movement in the 1960s. So that just gives you a picture that they were certainly sympathetic to certain things that you might refer to as social justice and the like of this. And McManus had been ordained by Cardinal Cushing in Boston. And Cushing was an ecumenist. He was one of the early people pushing for and encouraging interfaith dialogue. In his case, I think it was with Protestants, but McManus himself was encouraging dialogue with the Eastern Orthodox. McManus had been a peritus in the Vatican II's discussions about the liturgy. So these guys were not just somebody or anybody. They were at the forefront of pushing a kind of a progressive kind of agenda, if you like. And so you could argue that they had this progressive, liberal, modernist, whatever trajectory, including the idea of separation of church and state. And in Cushing's case, this would have been evident in virtue of the fact that when Massachusetts was voting over the question of whether or not to legalize birth control, Cushing basically pulled out of the, no pun intended, pulled out of the discussion, meaning that he said the Catholic Church will not weigh in here because, as we've heard so many times, the use of birth control or whatever is a private matter. And so this was Cushing's position. It says, and this is just, you can check some of these things just on his Wikipedia page, but he was also in favor of ending the U.S. Occupation in Vietnam and other kinds of things that would sort of indicate that he was more left of center in a lot of ways, though at the same time the story goes that somewhere along the line, he actually praised the John Birch Society, which is exactly the opposite. So you can see the complications here. But part of that, I think, was because of Cushing's so-called staunch anti-communism. But anyway, that would take us too far afield. Some of what I'm pointing to is just some of the intrigue. And again, to go to the 16th century, I'm jumping here. In the 16th century, before the calling of the Council of Trent, of course, you should also factor in, and I'm not going to really plumb the depths of this here because I have a presentation in the works which will get more into it, but you did have a number of people who, for instance, the group known as De Spirituale in Italy, including Cardinal Gasparo Contarini. Contarini is supposed to have been the originator, before Martin Luther, of the concept of sola fide, namely faith alone, which is one of the core principles of the Protestant Reformation. And yet here you have the Cardinal Contarini articulating it, and he was part of a group, again, the Spirituali is what they were called, that were working toward quote-unquote reform within the church, and this also included Cardinal Reginald Pole. And the point there, obviously, is that it's not obvious to me that you can make a case that the church, everything was right as rain in the church until Vatican II. Even taking into consideration the fact that if Vatican II was able to push a radically new agenda such that at the outcome of Vatican II, you had the creation of the counter-church, you had to, of course, have the seeds of this stuff in Rome, in the church, prior to Vatican II. If the church goes off the rails after Vatican II, and part of the reason it did was because of the way in which certain bishops voted, then those bishops had to already have been progressive, liberal, modernist in their thinking prior to Vatican II. So the question, of course, then becomes, when did this all start? I'm not trying to plumb the depths, but what I'm saying is you can push the conversation back to the 19th century. And by the way, in America, of course, you also have to take into consideration the quote-unquote Americanist heresy, which is associated with prelates like Cardinal James Gibbons, Archbishop John Ireland, Bishop Spalding, and some of these people, basically the gist of the Americanist way of thinking was that we should accommodate, here in the United States anyway, we should accommodate political liberalism and pluralism. Namely, we should say, look, the United States is a classical liberal project experiment based on the thinking of people like John Locke. And, of course, what we mean here by classical liberal is a person who says, and I'm echoing John Mearsheimer's very helpful three-point synopsis of this, of what classical liberalism amounts to, but it's a focus on individual rights. It's conjoined with the idea of toleration, and the reason for toleration is that we will never agree, according to the liberal, about first principles. Namely here, the liberal view is that when you ask the question, how should society be arranged? What goods should we pursue? What religion should we endorse? People will never agree. This is the liberals' way of thinking. And therefore, what you need to do is just tolerate a plurality of different views. Now, what's the role then of the government? It's not to endorse a particular way to live the good life. Rather, the government becomes a night watchman state. It's the Leviathan that basically is the backstop or the safety net to prevent anarchy. But it's very minimal. It's not supposed to take on the color of advancing one view of the good. And so this is, of course, John Locke, 17th century English theorist, very important in the imagination and the minds of the founding fathers of the United States. And it's only until you get to the late 19th and early 20th centuries that you start to get this progressive. And you'll remember that Theodore Roosevelt, was the first person to really attach himself to the name progressivism. And so there were many Republicans like Hoover who were progressives in this sense. But people start to warm up to the idea that the government can actually advocate for certain things. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of mixing of that with different ideas later on in the 20th century. But in any case, the history is very complex. And it's not obvious to me, just to kind of boil it down, it's not obvious to me that a person can plausibly make the case that the problems just started in the 20th century, or even in any way proximate to the 20th century. I mean, we've already I've cited examples that go back to the 14th century. Michael Hoffman somewhere points out the writings of St. Peter Damian, and he was talking about abuses amongst the priests that had to do with the sin of sodomy. And Peter Damian was writing, I want to say, the late 10th century or the 11th century. So again, some of these are moral failures, or at least that's the allegation. Some of them have to do with morality rather than doctrine and theology. So I do think that an important distinction has to be made in that regard, because otherwise, you can say, oh, well, the church has always had moral questions, but the doctrinal questions don't pose a threat to the indefectibility of the church or to doctrines like papal infallibility. You could argue that the Arian heresy, for example, is rather affirms some of these doctrines rather than speaks against them. So I don't want to make it look like what we're talking about here is that, well, certain people they have moral defects because, of course, strictly speaking, the doctrine of papal infallibility is couched in such a way that it doesn't depend, nor does it assert that the Pope or that the bishops or anything like that are morally without fault. So anyway, but I do think, nevertheless, that there are so many historically interesting episodes, and just the creation of the old Catholic Church after Vatican I is maybe the most recent parallel to this, that you can sort of see the same arguments being made there. And I do think that complicates the questions that we're asking. And I do think there are other reasons, intellectually, let's just say philosophical reasons, why I think now that the division between modernism and premodernism, or modernism and traditionalism, isn't as tenable as I thought it was a year ago. But I've been going for some time, so I will have to deal with that in another place. Thanks for listening. Hope to see you again in another video.